So good evening and warm welcome to everyone, including those who are joining us online. It's nice that we've got a good audience online as well. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Rob Waterman. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and International here at York St John University. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come and attend this lecture. It's great to see you here. So this evening's lecture will be led by Professor Luke Nifter. The York St John University School of Humanities is currently hosting Luke as a visiting professor following his prestigious award from the Leverhulme Trust. This award was in recognition of his specialism and expertise in research and teaching of modern American history, particularly political history. So we feel really privileged to be able to welcome him to our academic community. He's been with us for several months now. The US elections dominated world news for the last few months. President-elect Trump's cabinet choices continue to stimulate debate. So tonight's lecture will consider the US presidential election. Where do we go from here? Which in these turbulent times is of great interest to us all. It's my pleasure to introduce Luke. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It seems a lot has happened since the last time we were together, only a few weeks ago. I especially want to thank those who stuck with me for the full trilogy at this point. I recognize a few of you in the audience, either here in person or online. It's been quite a journey together over these last few months. So those of you who've been with me before understand that I try to do politics without being political. I do not do endorsements. I avoid making statements that sound partisan because my goal is to reach as many people on both sides as possible. I find once you formally take sides, the other side simply tunes you out. The closer it got to the election, the more that I was asked for my prediction about its outcome. If that's what one wants, there are plenty of experts out there who offer those. My goal instead is to use history to illuminate the present, where that is possible, and that means wading through things like context and nuance, things that simple predictions do not allow. To briefly review, and some of you might recall this in your distant past, in my first public lecture on October the 8th, titled The Year That Took Politics, after the title of my last book, I presented a fresh assessment of the 1968 U.S. presidential election, the most divisive in modern American history. I think that's still true. In my second public lecture on November 4th, on the eve of Election Day in the United States, that lecture was entitled The U.S. Presidential Election, What to Expect. I explored the similarities and differences between 1968 and 2024, and the extent to which 1968 has given us clues about the race and its outcome this year. In this final public lecture tonight, I will look at 2024 and beyond, and at what history suggests and patterns to look for, if indeed past is prologue, as the motto of the U.S. National Archives says it is. Unlike a Greek tragedy, which I've invoked before, I'm not sure we will resolve anything here in this third act. However, I would like to review where we've been, where we might be going, and then save time, just as before, for discussion of anything that might be of interest to you. First, where we've been. Let me start with something unorthodox, a conclusion that the 2024 presidential election was mostly a rerun of 1968. I've been exploring this topic through various published essays and speaking engagements since the beginning of this year, long before I joined you here in York this semester. When my book on the 1968 presidential election was published in August 2023, it was clear that there were things in common between the two political eras. However, it was not until January 2024, at the time of the first primary election in New Hampshire, that I published an essay that asked whether 1968 might be a useful guide to 2024, titled, What Biden Could Still Learn from Incumbent Presidents Who Decided Not to Run Again. I showed what unpopular, incumbent, centrist Democratic presidents Harry Truman in 1952, and especially Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968, considered early in their election years before deciding to withdraw. That was at a time when no one really knew, at least I didn't, that Biden would eventually withdraw from the race. Then there was perhaps the biggest parallel between 1968 and 2024, that so many Americans have come to distrust national institutions. virtually all levels of government, political parties, the national media, civic organizations, organized religious leaders, higher education, as well as others. Many commentators in 1968 wondered whether the nation had outgrown its political system, and whether the political class no longer had the ability to solve the nation's problems. One party failed and was thrown out of office, and the party that replaced it did not seem to do any better. Many people seem to have similar doubts in 2024. So, in mid-February, I wrote an essay titled, "The Sky Has Fallen, Just as in 1968." Yet the sky did not fall in 1968. The nation got through that dark time and returned to a more normal political era. Surely the lesson of history there was that we could do so again this year, even if that was not a popular opinion at the time, and perhaps not this year either. In March 2024, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s entry into the race presented fresh opportunities to derive lessons from 1968, when his father joined the race that year and began to surge at the time of his tragic assassination, fewer than 100 days later. It was another similarity between the years, not just the presence of Kennedys in the races, as I wrote in an essay in March, but stronger than usual third-party challengers and populist movements. Of the major candidates in 1968, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, former Vice President Richard Nixon, and former and future Alabama Governor George Wallace, it was arguably the latter who started the movement. Elements of his anti-elite, anti-establishment, anti-media campaign have been borrowed by all populist candidates on both sides of the aisle since, especially more recently by Donald Trump. The entry by Kennedy Jr. to the crowded race this year was also a warning to other would-be challengers. While much has been said about potential candidates such as California Governor Gavin Newsom, I wrote a second essay in March that argued he would be wise to follow the precedent of another California governor, Ronald Reagan, in 1968. Like Reagan, Newsom is a great communicator. He has executive experience leading the nation's most important state, but he also has liabilities. His political views might be too extreme. He's not battle-tested. He avoided primaries. He has no campaign infrastructure or national following. It would be extremely risky to engineer a takeover of the Democratic Party, especially when he'll have another chance. Like Reagan, Newsom's goal should not be being blamed if his party underperforms, but at the same time try to be associated with its victory if it does well. That means waiting for better political timing. However, even as the number of similarities between the years grew, 1968 has not always been a perfect guide to 2024. From a historical standpoint, March was the month to watch, since two of President Biden's heroes, Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson, withdrew from their re-election campaigns after pressure from the left wing of the party wanted them to step aside in favor of someone younger and more in tune with the future of the party. Truman was March 29th, 1952. Lyndon Johnson was March 31st, 1968. Those withdrawals then were considered late at the time, after the start of the primaries, but still early enough to allow the Democrats to find a replacement and still finish out the remainder of the primary season, when party differences are typically worked out. Biden would be old enough to remember when each of them was pushed out. I wondered whether Biden's State of the Union address, which was set for March 8th, 2024, meant something given how much later it was in the calendar than the usual January timing. However, the rest of March 2024 came and went without fanfare. It seemed to be an obvious example in which 1968 was not a guide to 2024. As of this midsummer this year, with the primaries behind us and the conventions just ahead, two of the biggest differences between 1968 and 2024 were the lack of political violence this year, given the assassinations in 1968 of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Senator Robert Kennedy in June. And secondly, that Biden did not appear to be inclined to withdraw as LBJ did. In July, I wrote an essay describing how Biden might still withdraw from the race, even at that very late stage, unprecedented really in U.S. history, based on the example of LBJ, which Biden did just 9 days later, on July 21st, following the first attempted assassination of former President Trump on July 13 in Butler, Pennsylvania. Within the span of only a fortnight, the two biggest differences between 1968 and 2024 were erased. That was the beginning of the busiest phase of the year for me, beginning in July as I just arrived here and was making preparations to be with you this semester. I was in Chicago as delegates and VIPs arrived for the Democratic National Convention in August. The eventful week was turbulent, especially trying to fashion a party platform that recognized substantial dissension over Israel and Gaza, as well as other issues. However, the protests this year were largely muted. Were not covered to the extent they could have been by the national media, and when it was all over, it was clear the convention had nothing of the violence the Democrats faced in America's second city in 1968. That year, the disruption in Chicago that stemmed from a deeply divided party helped to elect Republican Richard Nixon. It seemed to be another difference with history that this year's divisions would not help elect Donald Trump. However, I wrote another essay about two other challenges Vice President Kamala Harris would face as the party's nominee, similar to those Vice President Hubert Humphrey faced in 1968, when also suddenly he became a presidential candidate after Lyndon Johnson's surprise withdrawal. The primary challenge that both Humphrey and Harris faced was running on change and continuity simultaneously. I discussed a little bit of this last time. By that I mean they had to have their own policy proposals, just like any other candidate, but they were also the current vice president and tied to an unpopular administration and its past policies. They had to defend those past policies while also proposing new ones, all while not offending the current president, also known as their primary political patron. Since World War II, no vice president has been able to do all of these things simultaneously, with the exception of George H.W. Bush in 1988, arguably because he ran more on the continuity of the Reagan years than really on change. It's almost impossible to have a clear campaign theme in such a situation. The second challenge both Humphrey and Harris faced was not being from the liberal wing of the party, which they were, but running as a liberal. It's fine to appeal to your liberal base during a primary before generally shifting back to the Senate after the convention. However, neither Humphrey nor Harris had a proper primary, since their president dropped out late. That meant they had to appeal to both their bases, as well as centrists and crossover Republicans all at the same time. It's difficult to articulate much of a campaign message except in the blandest possible terms under such circumstances. I think that largely followed her campaign this year. The message that liberals want to hear, mostly in coastal cities, is one that simply doesn't take for many Americans in the heartland of the country. The liberal wing of the party no longer recognized Humphrey and Harris as one of them, since their time as vice president meant they became the primary spokesperson for an unpopular administration, whereas moderates and independents were not reassured either. The final essay I wrote prior to Election Day was on foreign policy, a subject I thought we might have heard more about this year, given the twin unpopular wars in Ukraine as well as Gaza, not to mention numerous other major foreign policy crises such as China this year. The year 1968 could again be a guide, since it was arguably the last time foreign policy played such a dominant role in the year of a presidential election. Then with another unpopular war in Vietnam, Russian military intervention in a neighbor, Czechoslovakia, and other global concerns, including China. The point of the essay was to explore, even in a year in which foreign policy played a major role, like 1968 and 2024, why foreign policy doesn't typically impact the way Americans vote in November. The short answer is that voters tend to vote more according to kitchen table issues and can relate to subjects like the economy, inflation, and their personal finances a lot more easily than a distant conflict or the terms of a multilateral agreement. As extensive as this overview might seem, it's still ultimately an oversimplification of all the factors that Americans considered when they voted on Election Day just a few weeks ago, or by various methods of early voting in the period leading up to November 5th. My goal throughout has been to show the utility of consequential history. Forearmed with knowledge of the past, we are better informed about the present. While there were almost an unlimited number of variables to consider, more than the human mind can probably consider, the ones I concluded that were the most important this year were the following. 1, a surprise presidential withdrawal by an unpopular president too late in the race for a replacement to be chosen using a process that would unite the party. 2, vice presidential succession and the challenge of running on change and continuity simultaneously, while also not offending one's political patron. And 3, stronger than usual third-party or populist movements reflecting unusual unrest among the electorate. In all 3 of these areas, the 1968 presidential election was a useful guide. Therefore, we could not only see how this played out before, but also how these 3 fairly unique elements interacted with each other this year. But we're also here tonight because we're interested to learn what history says about where we might be going next. There's a lot that we don't know, so we can hardly predict the future. For example, will Democrats shift back to the center, as they did under Clinton and under Jimmy Carter, just a few years after 1968, and even mostly Obama, I would argue? What will it take to make peace with the progressive wing and unite the party? Who will emerge from the next generation of potential party leaders? And will the party elders genuinely pass the torch to younger leadership? Will Obama finally come to dominate the party, as elders such as Carter, Clinton, Biden, and even Pelosi lose their grip? On the Republican side, is Trump unique or the beginning of a movement? Can J.D. Vance excite Trump's followers the way Trump does? What does the party leadership look like after Trump, when presumably his endorsement will remain very valuable for the indefinite future? There is a narrative in each party's activist wing. Progressive Democrats continue to see Donald Trump as an existential threat to American democracy. Populist Republicans see Trump's victory as a kind of vindication that will make him all-powerful. I think history shows that probably neither is correct. Let me suggest a few things to watch for in the near future between now and the 2028 presidential election, as if you've barely recovered from the last one, focusing on the various protagonists and antagonists of 2024. So first, the future president, Donald Trump. His election has been called by some the greatest comeback in U.S. political history, greater even than Richard Nixon's comeback in 1968, after losing his run for the presidency in 1968 narrowly, and then more decisively for the California governorship in 1962. I've seen at least one right-wing commentator say Trump's victory was greater even than that of Jesus Christ. These political moments are known for hyperbole, so I leave it to the verdict of historians to determine where Trump's comeback should rightfully be situated. Speaking of Nixon, I used to say he was the most investigated and persecuted politician in modern American history, although the Clintons must be up there somewhere too. But I think Donald Trump might be at the very top now. He's faced not one, but 2 impeachments, efforts to destroy him politically, personally, even financially. The view among some Democrats was that American democracy was not safe as long as people were permitted to vote for him, which is a conclusion that does contain at least a little irony. He could not be kept off the ballot and narrowly escaped the assassin's bullet, not once, but twice. After Americans elected Barack Obama, it's remarkable that the American people elected Donald Trump. Then, after throwing Trump out of office, the answer to Joe Biden was more Donald Trump. Somewhere there are some number of voters, perhaps in the small millions, who voted for Obama, then Trump, then Biden, then Trump again. Now that is a focus group I would love to see. On the other hand, it is clear that Trump does not respect traditional norms in politics. In fact, he's probably popular because he does not among his followers. He questions institutions, the need for allies, and alliances. He doesn't back down when challenged. He seems to thrive in opportunities to engage in political combat, unlike Richard Nixon, his friend and mentor, who sometimes concluded the best offense was to retreat and come back stronger tomorrow. As Trump transitions to a second term, his final one, he will never face voters again. Already there is a dramatically different energy, I sense, and momentum this time than there was after he won in 2016. The media consensus then was how radical he was. There was wide public outcry. Even among Republicans, many were not sure what they had gotten themselves into. The Trump takeover at the convention in Cleveland was a strange feeling. I remember, I was there that time too. It wasn't a hostile takeover, but the feeling among establishment Republicans was the Trump entourage seemed mostly like strangers who spoke and behaved differently. But then the party was weak, disorganized, really had wandered in the wilderness for several years since George W. Bush's presidency and really was unable to regroup during the Obama presidency. And in 2016, unable to resist Trump even if it had wanted to. During Trump's first term, there was a narrative, even among many Republicans, that it was un-American to be willing to serve in government during his presidency. As one of the only people I know who had an appointment in both the Trump and Biden administrations, there was a period of time I did worry whether it was wise for my career. Trump faces much less resistance now, or at least less organized resistance, even if it's because the resistance to him was not lessened, but really that it can't figure out or how to organize more effectively today. My reading of Trump's interview with podcaster Joe Rogan was that he really didn't know what he was doing the first time around, especially when it came to making those initial appointments. He was such a unique figure then that I don't think he had anyone helping him, who wanted to help him, or anyone he wanted to ask for help. He's much more energetically filling out the top ranks of the government this time around. The scrutiny on him, at least so far, is much less, even though he was much weaker last time. Ironically, his appointments this time around are arguably more radical, the kind he could never have appointed in late 2016. Republicans are much more willing to embrace Trump this time around, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and not let this opportunity go to waste. Even a flawed person can be used for good purposes, so the thinking seems to be. The next major milestone will be the midterm elections in November 2026, which is not that long away, which will not only elect 435 members of the House of Representatives, the entire lower chamber, a third of the Senate, but be a kind of dress rehearsal for the 2028 presidential election. A newly elected president almost always suffers major losses in their first midterm election. It simply isn't possible for an insurgent campaign to win the White House and also maintain that same degree of enthusiasm 2 years later when they are now the establishment fighting a new insurgency. No matter his successes or how few mistakes he makes, the Republicans are likely to either lose the House and possibly the Senate too, or the margins in either or both will become so narrow as to see each grind to a halt. Kamala Harris, who cast a record-breaking number of tie-breaking votes as vice president in the Senate, could be eclipsed even more by Vice President J.D. Vance. The Republicans have perhaps a year from now to put differences aside and get something done. Government tends to work around the 2-year term of their House of Representatives. One of those years is almost entirely consumed by running for election or re-election. The lower chamber rarely takes on major initiatives that keep it from campaigning or that can't be completed within a year, since unfinished pieces of legislation are required to start over in a new Congress, according to House and Senate rules. The year 2025 is the best chance for something to be accomplished for Republicans. Trump actually had a similar situation in 2017, and I would argue that very little got done. Since Democratic votes were not necessary to pass anything in the House or the Senate, the focus shifts instead to fighting among the Republicans. The House of Representatives today is more likely to work with President Trump than it was in 2017, but greater resistance can again be expected in the Senate to Trump. Moderate Republicans will again be key. Previously, in the first Trump term, they were those like Susan Collins of Maine, Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, just as Biden fought with his own moderate Democrats like Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona and Joe Manchin of West Virginia the past 4 years. People assume that when a party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House, that they're all powerful. That's not usually true. The skills needed to be an effective opposition party are simply not the same ones to be an effective majority. By the time you figure out how to be an effective majority, your time is up. It's a narrow window, since most of 2026 will be reserved for campaigning for the midterm elections, and as we start to see the first glimpses of how the 2028 presidential race might unfold. Second, the outgoing president, Joe Biden. He faces the scenario that Lyndon Johnson desperately tried to avoid and did, barely. A presidential term sandwiched between your chief rival or rivals. Not only can it be humiliating to see voters choose your rival as your replacement, since you were supposedly superior when you were elected, but there's not anyone immediately available to continue your legacy. In LBJ's case, he was never liked by the Kennedys when he was JFK's vice president. It was, after all, a political marriage. And who probably was never fully, and who probably, the Kennedys, never fully embraced LBJ as president, an office he was never supposed to attain, and might not have had it not been for JFK's assassination. In 1968, again that year, Johnson feared that he might be succeeded by another Kennedy, Robert, the father of today's Robert Kennedy, who endorsed and now works for Trump. Except RFK was also struck by an assassin's bullet in June 1968. After winning the California primary election, LBJ avoided being sandwiched in 1968 by Kennedy's, as he feared, but Biden will not. Unless a new generational leader emerges to continue Biden's legacy, he's an important and perhaps final link to a bygone era, one Carter and Clinton knew well too, to Democratic centrists who could compete in Middle America. I've never tallied it up, but it's possible that the Harris campaign used Biden, whether Joe or First Lady Jill, and Clinton this year in more places in Middle America than it did Harris herself. Since Obama, Democrats have become extremely adept at winning their core states, coastal areas, and virtually all big cities. I think Fort Worth, Texas is the only sizable city that Republicans are still winning in the entire country. But that has come at the expense of Middle America in both a geographic and a political sense, the middle. There were whole sections of the country Obama did not travel to. It would be convenient to see it as simply a matter of race, as has been said about Harris this year, whether the candidate or of the voters. But Hillary Clinton also, in 2016, did not try to compete in all of the 7 swing states that we've come to know this year, which has helped the ultimate swing state, at least historically, Ohio, in recent years become a reliable Republican state. It's not even considered one of the 7 swing states anymore. Today we refer to Pennsylvania, the way we used to refer to Ohio. It might be true that Harris had an impossible scenario. It might not have been winnable, absent major Republican errors, given the lessons of history regarding late presidential withdrawals and vice presidential succession. But her message during the campaign was basically Biden's, or at least little changed from his, and it simply didn't take in the swing states, or at least not as much as hoped. Biden is the only Democrat to have beaten Trump, don't forget that, in 2020. But I'm not sure we'll ever be able to assess that election outcome absent the COVID-19 pandemic, the on-again, off-again lockdowns, and the effect on the presidential election, which made it the most unusual in my lifetime. It's going to take a unique personality to emerge who can satisfy both the progressive wing of the party and reestablish a foothold in Middle America. The party that controls more of the center is usually the one that wins. And the Democrats conceded much of the center needlessly to Trump and Republicans this year. Harris might be able to reemerge in 2028 or run for the Senate or governor of California in 2026 when Gavin Newsom is term limited and can't run again, but I'm not sure. I don't think she's especially liked by a lot of Democratic insiders. The Newsom people that I know were happy to see her leave California and become vice president. If there's one thing that Democrats do not need right now, it's another potential party leader. When the history of her campaign is written, it would not surprise me if we learned that Democratic leaders were happy with the Harris and Walz team, if for no other reason because if they lost, it would be of no great consequence to the party going forward. But the fact is, at least temporarily, the Democrats have become the party of the elite, and Republicans, formerly the party of Wall Street, have become the party of the blue-collar, working class, and lower middle class, under the leadership of a self-described populist white trash billionaire. That could change quickly, for example, if the Democrats embraced those voters once again, and Republicans were led once again by an elite or an establishment figure, say a future Bush running for the presidency. There is still a viable Bush, George P. Bush, in Texas, and he's very hesitant about getting back in politics. I know one Bush insider who's trying to encourage him, but he doesn't think there's really an opportunity right now for another elite in the Republican Party. We shall see. On the Democratic side, I don't see how Democrats can walk back their commitment to, say, LGBTQ issues, or a progressive focus on the environment, or the image of being led by corporate, cultural, and media elites. Yet even corporate elites, who used to be Republicans, I assume most C-level leadership of the biggest corporations in Silicon Valley are all Democrats now. I assume most billionaires are Democrats, or at least say they are. Yet, as permanent as this seems, things can change quickly in politics. The affiliations of groups can shift dramatically if a party or an inspiring new leader simply starts talking about these issues again. The Democrats have a clear edge in the future when it comes to young people, minority groups, and immigrants. But what seems to be emerging in some of the data coming out this year and since 2016 is that once they obtain career success, pay taxes, own a small business, have assets to protect, start families, and especially get married, they leave cities, move to suburbs or other parts of the country, and they or their children are more likely to become Republicans. I have to say something about the media and their role in the campaign too, or at least what some now call the traditional, the legacy, or the mainstream media. Take your pick. This campaign might be the first in U.S. history in which candidates of both parties built their campaigns without them. Trump ran in 2016 as an anti-elite, anti-establishment, and anti-media candidate. This is an intentional strategy designed to attract voters who feel similarly. Voters, many of whom used to be Democrats, I would argue, and probably still are if they return to talking about their issues. He's long been critical of what he calls fake news, so it was no surprise that he avoided unfriendly media as much as he did this year. While unconventional, given the longer passage of time, he's been consistent about that. Republicans more generally believe the media is largely liberal, aligned with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and openly hostile to most Republicans, even more so than many in the media were to, say, the Clintons back in the 1990s. And more recently, I think they were unfair to her in her campaign in 2016. It's possible the media went so far in their desire this year to help Democrats that they actually harmed them. There are a fascinating number of essays being churned out every couple of days on my news feeds, being published primarily by, I would say, left-wing media outlets, documenting this, that the media covered up Biden's true condition, and they've been doing it long before 2024, that they embraced Harris so quickly they did not seem to consider the consequences of not having a primary or a proper convention where you work out differences in the party, and avoided the need to unite the party behind a candidate. There was simply no time or opportunity this year to do that. And frankly, that some of the media seemed more motivated to maintain the Harris campaign spending spree and ad buying and benefit from it than actually winning. The Harris campaign dramatically outspent Trump. We don't have the numbers yet, but it's 2 or 3-fold from what I've seen. When you factor in PACs and outside organizations, it's almost impossible to add up the true figures. I'm not convinced we have accurate figures for any recent election. Perhaps this is actually an implicit call for campaign finance reform or public financing of campaigns is really the argument that I'm making. Now, the Harris campaign dramatically outspent Trump. I think there are some legitimate reasons for this. For example, the fact that it's more expensive to advertise in big cities where Democratic voters are. Now, I'm also not sure how many of those voters would not have voted for Harris anyways. But the role of media in 2024 amplified Democratic weaknesses in middle America, as well as Trump's calls to tune out the mainstream media and tune in to other sources. There were, for example, few recorded debates. There were debates, but fewer than usual once we got past the primaries, which the media was unhappy about. Few serious sit-down interviews by either candidate with legacy, prestigious media programs, and one got the sense that neither candidate was overly concerned about that. I think this is because the leaders of both parties have privately concluded that a record number of Americans don't listen to what the mainstream media say. Another fascinating element to watch in the coming years is the role of Indian Americans in U.S. politics. This is something that's really not being picked up at all anywhere that I'm seeing. Those with family ties to the Indian subcontinent. For a country like the United Kingdom, with its long history and empire, this might not seem like news. What I'm about to say might sound quaint, even. But the United States has no traditional cultural ties with that part of the world. Every small town in America, has a pizza shop, multiple outlets for Mexican food or Tex-Mex food, and perhaps Chinese takeaway. The West Coast especially has had long ties with the Asian Pacific world, but not descendants of South Asia. The United States has a long association with Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Latin and Central America, given its geography and long borders with those areas. The town I grew up in, very much among those 7 swing states in the heartland of the country, in Bowling Green, Ohio, has never had a single Indian resident that I know of, or even an Indian restaurant. If you were to ask a resident what Indian food was, they might have admitted to trying canned curry from Aldi once or twice. And in the last 6 months, we now have 2 Indian restaurants, both opening just in the past few months during the 2024. It seems many of the shopkeepers are Indian, like any other part of the world, and I think it's probably an improvement over what we used to have. America, after all, is a nation full of immigrants and a place that rewards innovation, competition, risk-taking, and a place where immigrants can thrive. But these are all dramatic changes, all within the past few years, without even a single 10-year census to measure them. Since 2020, it's barely even a blip in the census. The political elite today doesn't yet understand these new citizens, doesn't know who they are, doesn't know where they live, doesn't know their concerns, and doesn't know which political party is a more natural fit. This is critical because in the span of only 10 years, they might become a substantial voting bloc in the U.S. and will surely stand in their own elections to public office. Some studies I've seen suggest that immigrants from the Indian subcontinent now prefer to come to North America more so than, say, the United Kingdom. As far as presidential politics go, it's the side of Nikki Haley's past that was never discussed or understood during her campaign. But then there was also Republican candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, J.D. Vance's wife, who had a small but still prominent role on the campaign, especially after he became Trump's running mate for the vice presidency, and even Kamala Harris herself. I travel a lot to various archives and universities in the U.S. In recent travels, when even stopping at a random truck stop in Middle America, it seems all the truck drivers are Indian. It'll be fascinating to see how U.S. politics changes and the fabric of the country itself. But it's also not being talked about. And both parties have already fallen behind the trend, I would argue. It'll be especially interesting to see how Democrats adapt, since they tend to be stronger of the two in terms of outreach to immigrants and minority groups and how they might modify their political messaging. There's much more I can comment on the 24 presidential election and possible paths forward. I didn't even talk about the donor class, the role of early voting in the future, whether we should expect to see more political pardons in the future, including our presidential family members, as we've seen even this week, whether we might see more political violence and the effect that might have, and what it might take to turn the noise level down and return to a more normal political era, something many Americans also desired after the presidential election of, one last time, 1968. But I think I'll leave it at that and be happy to discuss any subject further you might have an interest in. But before I do, I'd like to also thank you, the York St. John community. You've been a wonderful host this semester to my family and to me, and it's been an experience that's been personally and professionally rewarding. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. That was really interesting. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. So who would like to ask the first question? We've got a roving mic over there.
Thank you. Really brilliant presentation there, Luke. My question was about the US Senate. So you touched upon it in terms of a third being up for re-election fairly soon. So I'm just intrigued about term lengths and the kind of magnification of that particular arm of government and how infiltrated it is. You can see in terms of some of the appointments that have not happened as a result result of the Senate getting involved and having a view, and the majority leader, the appointment of, compared to who perhaps Trump originally wanted. Just intrigued on your observations in terms of the role of the Senate as a safeguard, I guess, to democracy in America too.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, typically, the House of Representatives is different than the Senate, because having 435 members, I mean, it's still a very elite group. I mean, the majority of them, I assume, are probably at least small millionaires. The size of the House hasn't changed since, I think, about World War II, or at least since Hawaii and Alaska were invaded. But it's much closer to the people. The congressional constituencies are about 700,000 people each, 750, depending, plus or minus. But the Senate's different. The Senate being fixed at 100 doesn't change. Much more elite. I think everyone except for maybe Joe Manchin was a millionaire this last time around. And I think I have two observations I would make. One, I think the Democrats have done a much better job this time around. I think at the end of the Obama years, for example, they left so many judicial vacancies open for Republicans. And so when Trump became president in 2017, he had these historic fights with Republicans, especially Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, even Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. Well, McConnell's retiring now, so it's going to be there has not been a change in Republican leadership in the Senate in 20 years. And Trump wanted his own type of leader, but the Senate's different. The Senate's older, it's more mature, it's a different deliberative kind of body than the House is. The House tends to be swayed much more by both parties' activist wings. The Senate is much more centrist. Its rules are different. They have rules like the filibuster, where even if the minority can stop procedure, it really takes effectively 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate, not 51, due to the concept of the filibuster. So what we know right now is that Trump is not going to get his way in the Senate, that the new Republican leaders can be much more like Mitch McConnell, outgoing. But that's not so bad if you're a Republican, maybe not if you're Trump. If you're a traditional Republican, you look back at Mitch McConnell, fill those vacancies that Obama left open. I mean, right now the Senate is racing during its remaining days, is controlled by Democrats, to fill every vacancy, to do everything it can to manipulate rules, which is frankly what it should be doing. I mean, if you're the party in power, you take advantage of that. You don't break the rules, but you manipulate them as much as you can. And I feel like under Obama, they gave Trump an opportunity that they shouldn't have given him. Supreme Court, I mean, Trump appointed 3 justices in 4 years. That's unheard of. I mean, a lot of presidents who were president for 8 years might get 1 or 2 picks. So I feel like the Democrats have done a much better job preparing for Trump, which shows you how much of a surprise he was the first time around to everyone. Now, I'm not sure there's ever going to be a Trump tell-all memoirs, but if there are, I think it's going to be that even he was surprised that he won the first time around. He seemed really surprised. I said this last time. I was in Vietnam for a month doing book research, and I voted absentee before I left, and I assumed I was going to come home and be President-elect Hillary Clinton, like everybody did. And it was such a surprise. I think the second thing I'll say is a lesson of Republicans and Trump the first time around is that if they can find an area to focus on, like judicial appointments, then they can stay out of areas they disagree. The media has made such a thing about, well, Republicans are going to control the House and the Senate and the White House. That doesn't really mean anything. I mean, Trump had that briefly. George W. Bush had that when he was elected in 2000 over Gore. And you could say Bush got a little bit done in those first 2 years. I mean, they got domestic things like No Child Left Behind, passed a big education bill. But then those first 2 years were so dramatically interrupted by 9/11. So it's kind of difficult to appraise those first 2 years. But then similarly, Bush got wiped out in 2002, even worse in 2006, brought Nancy Pelosi to the speakership for the first time, a woman. So it's hard to say. I think probably what happens is, like I said, since the votes of Democrats don't matter for passage, although they can do an awful lot to manipulate the rules and obstruct Republicans. Democrats haven't given Republicans near the advantage this time, the last time. And so all the spotlight becomes on all the infighting among Republicans. So I think now all of a sudden the stars of the Senate are no longer the moderate Democrats. but the moderate Republicans, because all it takes is a swing voter to stop everyone. The margins are so narrow. It takes, if one person happens to get sick that day or miss a vote, that means everything for your agenda. So I think actually, history would say that there's going to be infighting among Republicans, and that's what our spotlight's going to be on. And that when one party controls all three parts of government, they actually get surprisingly little done. Now, we will see. On the other hand, I will say one more thing, is that people seem more accepting of a Trump presidency this time. It was such a surprise last time, even to Republicans, that, Democratic friends are just sort of, I don't like it, but sort of shrug, let's get on with life. And Republicans, it's all, this time around, Trump has people in the media who are commenting positively on him. That didn't happen last time. He had people throughout government who sort of embraced some of his ideas. He didn't have that last time. So there are people who might not like Trump, but sort of like what he stands for in places that they simply weren't last time, because it really was a surprise at all levels of government. So I think that foreshadows maybe something will get done, but probably not historically. I think Democrats have planned damage control much better than last time.
Thank you. Next question, you're in the middle here.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to sort of focus in a little bit in terms of what we've seen this year and the future, in terms of there's been an interesting discussion around what the president can legally do and what might constitute illegal actions. And do you think in the years ahead we're in this new era of norm now in terms of the president's actions being very scrutinised in the legal system, or do you think we'll return to a time where the president certainly isn't above the law, but the actions are justified within the office?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, let me give you a typical academic answer. I think it's going to be a combination of each. If you read back to the New York Times or the Washington Post in the late 1960s, I love to assign to students, that the New York Times has this online portal called the Times Machine, where you can actually see the PDF pages of the newspaper with the advertisements and everything, which is my favorite thing to read from the era. You can turn the pages, and you can read it just like someone would back then if they had a tablet back then. And you read the commentary of the late 1960s, and it really was that the Vietnam era is the most divisive period in U.S. history, and there's never going to be anything like it anymore. And you look back now, and I think most of my students, I spend most of my time with 18, 19, 20-year-olds who can't relate, who that era seems quaint compared to today's challenges, and that seems to be a period of history that's so ancient to them, as if to have no possible relevance to their lives. And so I think going forward, it's entirely possible that both scenarios happen, that we do find a way to return to a quieter, more normal political era. The lesson of the 1960s was that in the 1970s, both parties returned to a calmer moment. Gerald Ford definitely brought the noise level down. Jimmy Carter was a much calmer president than Lyndon Johnson. But that in the long run, we may look back at this time and it looks quaint. It's hard to relate to it. And that the students of the future see no possible relevance to their lives one day. So I think I would sort of split the difference between the two scenarios.
Yeah, question over here.
Thank you for your talk today. I would like to ask a quick question. How do you think, to what extent will Trump want to withdraw from, being a security guarantor in Europe? And if he would like to do so, he's clearly displeased how the European NATO is doing. So how do you think, will he try to resolve the Ukrainian conflict without the involvement of European states?
This is a huge question. I remember when I was in Vietnam in 2016 for election day, I gave a talk at a university, an academic talk just like this one, at a university in Da Nang, which is sort of halfway up the coast. And one of the people sitting was the provost of the university, who actually was an old comrade of Ho Chi Minh's, kind of education advisor. So he was old, and he had interpreter sort of whispering in his ear, kind of close by as I was talking. And I wish he would have commented on what I said, because I'd love to get his perspective, given the events of his life that he observed. I think the events of our lives that we've observed since Trump the first time around is that we don't necessarily take Trump literally, and we learned that. I mean, Trump didn't withdraw from NATO in 20. I mean, he talked a bit about it. He suggested that the so-called special relationship with the UK was not really special. He suggested withdrawing out of treaty organizations with Canada and Mexico. And when I was in Vietnam, that was the big concern then, is Barack Obama, fundamentally altered policy with Vietnam, our former enemy, in 2016. I mean, Bill Clinton normalized relations in the 1990s, which was a huge changing point. But that was too early. But Americans didn't really digest it at that point. But 2016, Obama, went to Hanoi, and it really began a process of billions of American investment in Saigon, Hanoi, building a whole university, Fulbright University of Vietnam. And so I gave this talk about an American diplomat who was ambassador to Saigon in the mid-60s, who was the focus of a book a couple books ago. And then we got to the Q&A. Every single question was, what about Trump? Does he end the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP as Obama called it, in this huge kind of Trans-Pacific trade agreement? So it was the exact same question as we heard with Trump the first time. Obviously, I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's very unlikely that Trump withdraws from anything, because I think he has bigger concerns. I think he's much more concerned about Russia. He's much more concerned about China. And so I think Trump will make a lot of noise about treaties and other countries paying their fair share. But at the end of the day, Trump is still a passing phase of the Republican Party. And he's old. He's not going to be around forever. And the party will probably, he'll be influenced, he'll influence it going forward. But it's going to go back to sort of traditional multilateral diplomats, that the Republican Party is known for the last, since the Reagan years. So I suspect he's going to make a lot of noise. He's going to make a lot of threats, as he does. But look at just this past week. We have Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau visiting Mar-a-Lago. The first person I noticed to congratulate Trump was French President Macron. And they didn't really get it was, one day they were brothers, arm in arm, and then the next day they didn't like each other. They had fights over Twitter like everyone else with Trump. So I'm guessing he's going to make a lot of noise. But at the end of the day, I remember one person told me, who was around when Trump started his campaign in 2015, he's like, at the end of the day, you have to understand the kind of person Trump is. You can't think of him like a politician. He's not a politician. He builds tall buildings in New York City for a living, which means he works mainly with Democrats and unions, people who are not Republicans. And New York City is not the city that you typically go to rehabilitate your political career if you're a Republican. And Trump is the type where, he said, we have a problem, it's really bad, you're my enemy, I hate your guts, we're never going to talk again, and then tomorrow we're going to make a deal. It's going to be okay. It's going to be great for both of us. I love you like a brother. I mean, it's that tumultuous thing of dealing with Trump. And we've learned that I don't think we know how to deal with him, but we understand it's different than other politicians. And so, I remember, I gave this example before, so at the risk of a few of you who are here, you'll hear it a second time. I remember asking Nikita Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, who died a couple years ago, about his father's, when he was General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1960, making what he said was an endorsement of John F. Kennedy. And he defeated Nixon. And of course, it's not really an endorsement, because as far as I know, he had no vote in the United States for Kennedy. But Khrushchev always claimed, and was quoted in the New York Times in 1961 as saying that his support of Kennedy in 60, he felt was worth 500,000 votes, however you calculate that. And of course, that was a margin that Kennedy won in 1960. And so I asked Sergei, I said, about his father's decision to lean more toward Democrats in the early 60s. I said, what do you think about that? He said, it was a mistake. I said, what do you mean? He said, because one thing we learned about Richard Nixon is he was a good politician. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, someone you can make a deal with. Trump is coarse, You know, he's difficult to work with, but you can make a deal with him. And someone who builds tall buildings in New York City is used to making deals. You win some, you lose some. Over the long scheme, you want to feel good. I think he's going to want reassurance from, say, NATO partners that they're paying something closer to their quota on defense. Even if it's not as much as they want to pay, you know, meet him somewhere. If you can, Trump is the kind of person that if you can make him feel like he won, even if he didn't really win, you win.
Right. Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
Thanks. It might seem like a bit of a small question, but anyway. You said that there was a lot less use of traditional media in this election this time round. Would you say that that's because there was a large use of social media, or because, as you said, there was a distrust of the main media? And then off the back of that, would you say that, at least what I saw in media, Kamala Harris used a lot more of that kind of social media, podcast, she followed a lot of social media trends. Would you say that that's a kind of contributed to the reason why she lost? Was she taken less seriously because of that? Just wanted to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, media, I think, is one of the most interesting things in terms of where we go from here. Of course, my remarks refer more to traditional mainstream media, legacy media, the three major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the major cable outlets. I thought it was fascinating during the first Trump 4 years. Everyone assumed that the more right-wing Fox News would simply be a rubber stamp on everything that Trump did. And I think it mostly was. But because it was the only major conservative outlet, it had to find moments, and it would go out of its way to show disagreement with Trump, even if over very minor issues. Because on the major issues, there was agreement. And even when there was these minor areas of disagreement, Trump would blow these up into something huge. They're not reliable, maybe they're guilty of fake news, like all the rest. And what you saw during the first Trump 4 years is an entirely new media ecosystem grew up to the right of Fox News. There's all kinds of White House credentialed news organizations that we didn't even consider legitimate news organizations. I mean, if indeed a White House West Wing press pass is a sign of being a legitimate news organization. And the media landscape completely changed under Trump. There's all kinds of outlets to the right of Fox News now. I think Fox is going to, again, have a similar pressure on it to show independence. And while I think a majority of its on-air hosts are very sympathetic to Trump, there are a few that have been much more independent. Like Bret Baier. I'm surprised. Bret Baier did the Kamala Harris interview for Fox News, which he was combative, but he's one of the ones that stood up. And when Fox was in a lawsuit a few years ago, a lot of the tweets that were entered into evidence in court were surprisingly, sent by Fox hosts and senior producers were critical of Trump. So it's not necessarily a rubber stamp that we thought. But I think what's going to be interesting going forward, I don't know what the mainstream media does. I mean, whether it's on the right wing or on the left wing, they've got to be looking at the success of these podcasts. And I mean, I'm assuming that in terms of pure numbers, the Rogan interviews with Trump and Vance have got to be the two biggest watched single interviews. If nothing else, the media set aside politics. They want to earn profit. I mean, how do you capture some of that? Do you change the format of your shows? Do you offer Rogan an hour in prime time every night? Where do you go? Like, how do you modify? I'm not talking about political strategy. How do you modify your business strategy to capture some of that? Because obviously, millions of people. Now, I'd be curious to know who that audience is. Are these people who shifted from traditional media to podcasts? Are these people who never really paid attention before at all? Are these new voters who crossed HT? How many weren't even old enough to vote? How many, it's their first election they voted in? How many are old enough to vote but didn't vote before? And there's all kinds of buckets of different people in these audiences. And if I were the mainstream media, it's how do you capture, some of that lightning in a bottle is what I'd be looking at. Because I think that to the point of your question, what we consider media has changed. And in a way, media has always changed. And media has always been an interface between the public person and the public. So I think it's just evolving in a place that it might have evolved anyways. But I think probably there's some hard discussions going on, and now Comcast is going to spin off NBC, and we don't know what's MSN. There's going to be a lot of perhaps media changes going on. One thing media people told me during the first Trump years is while they might have opposed him on air, privately they loved him. And I don't mean they loved him politically. I mean, business was good. Advertising revenue was up. Every time I went to DC or New York for a media thing, everyone from the driver at the airport to the technician in the studio, I mean, they looked exhausted after Trump. It was a constant news story. I mean, it was exciting to be in media. Profits were up in an industry where profits are down historically, where newspapers are closing, where legacy media outlets, even in major cities, they don't even have a newspaper anymore. So I think, you know, the media friends I have, right after the election, said something like, buckle up, it's going to be busy 4 years. I think it's going to be.
Thank you.
There's a question at the front.
A couple. Yeah. Do you want to go first? I'll go first. In light of Supreme Court's ruling, Trump versus the United States, how do you perceive the decision impacting the balance of power among branches of government and the accountability of future presidents?
This is another one where the media has mainly been saying, well, a difference now compared to Trump's first term is the Supreme Court's more conservative. And I think it is more conservative. But, you know, under Trump, there was a lot of ink spilled about how Chief Justice Roberts actually was a swing voter on that court. He was often the deciding vote against Trump for 4 years. So I would argue actually a little like Fox News, being under pressure to find disagreements with Trump, even if they're small areas, the court will be doing the same thing. I think much of the momentum in government and media is to be opposed. Well, you're opposed to whoever's in power. And so while the media is often claimed by Republicans to be liberal, and maybe on the whole it is, what it's more likely to do is to be opposed to whoever's in power. Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a trained journalist, he once wrote in his papers something like about how the media conducts itself. He wrote something in his personal papers like, you know, never in the history of journalism has there been a newspaper headline that says 10 million people slept soundly last night. And I think that's what we're going to find, is that with Trump in power, these institutions are going to look for ways to disagree with them. They might not be fundamental disagreements, but I think there are going to be differences, because I think that's what we saw in the first 4 years under Trump. So, you know, I would say in the long history of the court, I would describe it as being generally dominated by liberal Republicans, whether that be, you know, the Brown versus Board era, the Roe v. Wade era. You know, those chief justices were, I would call them kind of Eisenhower, liberal, moderate to liberal Republicans. The court on the whole is probably more to the right of that today. I mean, there weren't really many genuine conservatives back then. If they were probably Democrats back then. So the court has shifted, but I think like the media, it's going to be looking for chances not to be stereotyped, not to be predictable. It's going to look for chances to disagree with Trump. Even if on the whole, I think they'll be more in agreement now than they were before.
There was another question.
Thank you. How influential / dangerous might it be in the next 4 years, bearing in mind the presence of Elon Musk?
If I were Elon Musk, and I'm not, obviously, or Ramaswamy, I think you're going to realize it's not fun to be in government. It's a lot more fun to make money and innovate and create machines that can go to space and things like this. If I were Elon Musk, I'd get pretty tired of government pretty quickly. I mean, if he has any hands-on involvement at all in Doge and whatever else he's involved in, I'm guessing most of that's going to be delegated to others in those offices. I mean, government's not that exciting. I mean, I worked in the Speaker's office in a House committee when I was 23. I was a research assistant for an MP, a Labour MP from Wimbledon in the Blair second government 20 years ago. There's two systems I would argue are pretty similar and similarly dysfunctional at times between the House of Commons and the House of Representatives. It's mundane, it's not exciting on most days. And so I think that's what he's going to discover. And he's going to realize that, you know, we see a president as being all powerful sometimes. Most of what a president does is reacting to situations that are out of their control. I mean, for a decision to reach the president's desk, it has to have passed sort of every other layer of government on the way up to the Oval Office, where decisions are typically made. I mean, only the most difficult decisions reach the Oval Office. And I think a president is, doesn't want to be bothered with a lot of the minutiae. And I'm not even sure how much Trump wants to be president, as much as he enjoys the process of winning and power and all. And he's not hardly the first one in that area. John F. Kennedy, I would argue, like much better running and getting power than being president. So I think actually, our government's actually not as exciting as it seems. And I would be surprised if their tenures are that long.
Question at the back.
I'd like to ask now, what's the Trump 2.0 policy regarding the Dreamers?
First of all, Trump 2.0, that might be the good analogy. Probably should borrow that one. It's going to be hard. I mean, Trump made a lot of noise during the campaign about mass deportation. And so probably the Dreamers are going to be part of that. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to be expensive and costly, and it's going to cost him a lot of votes, even among Republicans. I would guess that his activity in this area is going to be a bit like his activity when it comes to multilateral agreements. Earlier question. He's going to make a lot of noise. He's going to have to show that he did something to get return on investment, given the rhetoric of the campaign. But it's a little like, how much effort did he spend the first 4 years talking about he's going to build that wall with Mexico, Mexico's going to pay for the wall, and how much of that happened? I think he did enough to say that he tried to follow his campaign promise. He did enough for the photo op and for it to look like it was a legitimate effort, but obviously it wasn't completed. So I think in this area, he's going to have to do something. He'll probably find something like there are some, obviously there are some areas where I think Democrats and Republicans can cooperate. For example, criminal background screenings. People come to the country. I mean, I don't know what nation would not agree on something at least that basic. So I think Trump can have some achievement like that. It would be enough for him to say he followed a campaign promise, but I just don't expect a major attack on immigrants, Dreamers, kids, to come over with their family. I just don't see it, because even if Trump talks that way, Republicans are going to realize we're going to get wiped out in the congressional elections in 2 years or in 4 years or in 6 years. And at that point, it's his own party who says, this is as far as we can go.
Thank you. Any more? Yeah, there's one at the back.
Yeah, so with China threatening like America's global hegemony, to what extent would you say China's going to influence Trump's foreign policy for the next 4 years?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'm not sure how to characterize Trump's first 4 years with China, other than I think Trump was the first president to visit Vietnam 3 times. I mean, that's really unusual. I mean, I think that the current strategy, which I think, by the way, is fairly bipartisan. I mean, there's significant buy-in by leaders of both parties, is effectively to encircle China, whether it be militarily, economically, in terms of trade. And we've seen that with resources poured into Vietnam. I think the United States, both parties have tried to strengthen ties with India, but Modi's been a little bit more independent than I think American politicians would hope. I think Japan is always, Taiwan. The Taiwanese president just visited Hawaii this past week, and that, resulted in all kinds of condemnation out of Beijing, because they see it as, you've received as a head of state someone from a renegade province. So I think there's actually not a lot of disagreement among both political parties on China. I always sometimes joke, but I think it's true, that while there are very few issues that bring together both parties today, there are a few. Concern over China, concern over AI, and concern over social media. And they might agree in their own way how to tackle those problems, but I think there is consensus these are legitimate issues for the country to deal with. So I would suspect, a lot is going to come down to his national security picks. Walz, his new security advisor, is I mean, he has a new book out, which is probably good. I probably need to go read it to figure out what he's thinking of these days. Secretary of State Rubio, I don't know. I mean, a lot of times Secretary of States get pushed aside, and it's really National Security Advisor who's the more important role, because proximity to power is everything. And National Security Advisor is down the hall in the West Wing, and the Secretary of State's tied up most of the time running a large government bureaucracy. So I'm guessing the policy is going to change. Trump was tough on China, at least the rhetoric. Now, maybe in 50 years from now, and the records of private conversations come out, that maybe they are much friendlier, that China thought he could make a deal with Trump. I think China also understands Trump better, like the American people, the second time around. But I'm guessing that his policy is largely going to change. I think Biden was fairly tough on China. And I think Trump's talk of tariffs has really raised Chinese concern, as well as Canadian concern, as well as Mexican concern, on what happens. And I'm guessing there's going to be a pretty early meeting between Xi and Trump, but that the American policy will largely continue unchanged.
Thanks. There's a question in the middle here.
Do you think the Electoral College has worked successfully in the last few elections, and whether it's still working as intended?
Yeah, Electoral College always comes up. It's such an awkward feature, the way that the U.S. presidential elections work. And I don't think it's ever been popular over lots of periods of time. I mean, if you go the closest, I'll put it this way, Americans have talked about abolishing it or modifying it for longer than I've been alive. Actually, the closest the United States ever came to abolishing it was around 1950, when it was actually Republicans wanted to abolish it. And the argument back then was that Republicans then, who were sort of in the insurgency in the Truman years, the late 40s, early 50s, before Eisenhower came to power, what Republicans then wanted to do was to never allow a Democrat like FDR to come to power again, because he won 4 elections and he locked Republicans out of the White House for 20 years, from 1933 to 1953. And so back then, in the late 40s, early 50s, it was Republicans who wanted to get rid of it. And looking over, and the lead Republican was Henry Cavanaugh, and looking over, and actually they got it passed by the Senate, and almost passed in the House, until some conservative Republicans came in and sabotaged it, and it went away. And Lodge, in his personal papers, suggest his real motivations for wanting to get rid of it. He had gone back to, I think, the presidential elections of either 1900 or 1896, the first one under William McKinley that Republicans won, and had somehow calculated that had there been no Electoral College vote, or had it been more on a straight popular vote, he calculated somehow that Republicans might have won 1 or maybe 2 more presidential elections than they did. So back then, it was Republicans who felt they were being disadvantaged by the Electoral College. It was clear to me, it was political. The party that wants to get rid of it is the party that feels that it's been harmed by it. But the party that feels it's been benefited from it thinks it's noble and honorable, in the spirit of American tradition. So today, I would argue the opposite. Democrats want to get rid of it primarily because they feel that it's harmed them. And it's true. I mean, you've had, whether it's Bush Gore in 2000, Trump Clinton in 2016, there have been more than one case where the winner of a presidential election actually lost the popular vote. But I would say similar, Democrats made a lot of noise for 2 years on getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate, because Republicans were obstructing everything. Well, you don't hear a lot of talk about that anymore, because they're going to be in the minority, and they're going to need that filibuster to block what Republicans try to do. So I think politics polarizes everything. It's awkward. People sometimes say, well, will there ever be another American Constitutional Convention where we fix these things? I just don't see how. Absent some great national tragedy, maybe even bigger than 9/11, that would unite people, would clear away political thinking, and would change or refine some institutions. I think the fact is that actually most of these ambitions to change things, it's because a party views them as being either disadvantageous in the past or because they seek some other advantage. And I think that's probably what's going on now, just as it was with Republicans in the mid-20th century.
That question over there?
Cheers, thank you. This is a really interesting point. I think there was a very brief touch upon about populism in particular. That was good. I want to draw upon a bit more. I think it seems a lot of pressing debates this election in general, where things like Roe v. Wade, things like gun laws, use of media and stuff like that. Would you say that America is being more polarised? Would you say that populist candidates are being more favoured? Or would you say that there are just a lot of hot topics that just needed to be dealt with this year?
Yeah, that's the, in a way, that's the overarching question over the whole year, the way I look at it. I remember 20 years ago this semester, I taught my first university history module. It was U.S. History Survey Part 2, which we tended to find them either on that side of the 1860s or this side of the 1860s. So it was on the more modern side. And it was the 2004 presidential election, Bush versus John Kerry, Senator John Kerry. And the media back then were saying regularly that perhaps this is the most divided the nation's ever been. And walking into the classroom one day, I thought it was a teaching moment, having just listened to this on National Public Radio, the latest story about how divided America was, which is something you hear seemingly almost every election. But I asked 18-year-old, 19 or 20-year-olds, really it's the first year, second year, kind of survey of U.S. history. I said, do you really think, so we're halfway through the year, this is October, do you really think the country is more divided now than ever before? And there's that pause where they're very timid, and don't want to raise their hand, it's a talk, or some things never change. And then finally a few brave hands went up. And the first one said, what about the 1860s? The Civil War. So, well, I think that is an example. Several 100,000 Americans were killed. We were literally killing each other en masse. That probably is a time we were more divided. And the second one said, what about the 1960s? And I remember when the first figure from the Nixon era that I ever met was Ray Price. I would describe as kind of a moderate to liberal Republican. Prior to becoming Nixon's chief speechwriter, he wrote both of his inaugural addresses, several of his books he ghostwrote, and a lot of his major speeches. He had been lead editorial writer for the New York Herald Tribune before it went defunct. In 1964, Ray Price wrote the lead editorial for the Herald Tribune endorsing Lyndon Johnson. The first time the Herald Tribune had ever endorsed a Democrat in its history, going back to the 1860s or whatever it's been. And so I look back at that time period. Price always said to me something like, if the 1860s was an actual civil war, the 1960s was a kind of proxy civil war. The amount of violence, unrest, bombings, looting, arson, everything. And I think the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's killing, was small compared to a much longer continuum where over 100 American cities were burned in the second half of the 1960s. So at the end of the day, I don't know the answer to your question, other than the fact that I think that there is a current surge of populism and third parties. They're like the late 60s. There are a lot of Democrats and Republicans saying things like, I wish I had a better choice this year. I wish you had stronger candidates. And it's possible that in some parties you have bad years. Now, in this case, you have bad years at the same time in both parties. So I think it is, as difficult as these moments seem, it's important to remember how quickly they're forgotten when a new face emerges on the political scene. And so we're a moment away from forgetting our troubles. If a new John F. Kennedy shows up tomorrow, or a new charismatic centrist Republican, I think it is possible to unite the country again. But the parties themselves are just as divided amongst each other as the two parties are amongst themselves. So I do think it's possible, but I think it's going to take fresh leadership. It's going to take a fresh face, and someone new, someone who doesn't have a record of being divisive. So maybe I'm an optimist, a hopeless optimist. But the lesson of the 1960s was we did return to a quieter political era. Ford, Carter. I think one of the other aspects are getting back to a point when one party wins decisive elections. I don't mean landslides, but I mean for a party to have a mandate, it has to win, and people have to perceive that it was fair. If an election is so close, people still talk about, was Trump cheated out of 2020? I think there's fraud in every election. Every election. That's not the question. The question is, was there enough fraud to make a difference in the outcome? I'm not convinced of that in 2020, but I think we need to return to an era where one party at least wins by enough, that even if you discount the result by some degree for fraud or whatever goes on, that it was still a mandate. And I think that does allow us to get back to more historical norms in terms of one party can govern, it has a sufficient majority in the House and Senate to get things done, and then people decide either they were happy with it or they weren't.
Great, thanks. Any final questions? We're running out of time and it's actually getting quite chilly in here, at least at the front. Okay, I will therefore draw this evening to a close, but thank you very much for attending, and can you join me in showing appreciation for your comments?